Welcome to Readerzz, the podcast for the lifelong learner. Join us on our weekly dose of wisdom where we talk about the real-life lessons and applications of books. Enjoy! Welcome back to Readerzz, everyone. Today we are once again joined by Dr. Jeffrey Reynolds, author of Every Mile Matters. Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Reynolds.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, and today we're gearing up for that part 3, the final episode of this book. And we've kind of made it to the last stretch here, and this is the part of the story that really feels the most human to me. After everything that you've been through, everything that you've ran through, the races, the recoveries, the rebuilding, right? This section almost feels a little quieter, more reflective, right? It's less about the finish line itself and a lot more about what you do after crossing them. So without further ado, let's dive right in.
Sure.
So you start here, chapter 16, retracing my steps, right? And here you open by literally going back, right? You talk about the roads, the hospital halls, the finish lines, and I really love how you didn't erase these places. I think a lot of people who may have gone through what you did would have never wanted to go back or never wanted to revisit those memories, but you went back. And I think here it almost feels like you're closing the loop between the man who was fighting to survive every moment and the new person that you almost became and the transformation that you went through. I kind of want to ask though, right? I mean, like I mentioned, I think a lot of people might have avoided those places altogether or just had such a negative connotation with those things. What made you want to revisit those same roads rather than leave them behind?
Hey, look, those roads are uncomfortable in so many ways, but they're now a part of who I am. And going back there gives me gratitude. And I'll give you an example of where once you've gone through this, you need to live it every day. There's the place where I go to get medical care where my oncologist is has a parking garage next to it, very dark parking garage. When I was at the height of my treatment, it was during the winter months. I finished in March, for example, here in the Northeast. And I was back there yesterday for a routine checkup. Everything was fine, everything's good. But just driving in there brought me right back to where I was and going for chemo infusions and that kind of thing. And so, both literally and figuratively, you wind up going back there to that place. And, I left there with this time a clean bill of health. And so that feels really good, but it gives me gratitude that I went there so many times when I was sick and powering through treatment. And now I'm fine. I'm I'm living the dream. And so, there's a lot of folks who go through cancer, go through some medical condition or any life's event and say, I just want to put that all behind me. That's really hard to do because it becomes a part of who you are. And so, for me, I don't necessarily, I'm glad I'm not in that same place, but going back there for a moment gives me new appreciation for the place I'm at now, creates empathy for folks who might be in that spot as we speak. And it's just a useful exercise. It doesn't leave you. And I always think, retracing the steps is better than avoiding them. And so I go back all the time. And look, when you have a diagnosis like this, you always worry a little bit that it's going to come sneaking up behind you again. And so experimenting with that, going back and almost like dancing with the fear. I think it's a useful exercise. In the book, I use the metaphor of running alongside the fear, and just jogging alongside it for a while and then leaving it behind. But you jog beside it for a little while to bring you back to that place, to give you that appreciation and that gratitude, to remind you kind of where you were and how far you've come. And so I visit that place every now and again. I don't want to stay there very long because I'm moving forward, but visiting it every once in a while, I think is a useful exercise.
Yeah, I think a lot of what your journey is and a lot of what you also talk about, right, is it reminds me a lot of The Hero's Journey, right, by Joseph Campbell. I don't know if you've heard of it, but essentially it's a lot of that same method or the same track that a lot of stories or heroes or protagonists follow in a lot of stories, right? You have a call to adventure, you cross the threshold, you have your trials and failure, And then in the hero's journey, it's almost identified as like a death and rebirth, right? Facing your biggest challenge yet, your largest obstacle, and then the hero gets past it, right? You have changes, revelation, things like that, and essentially it's a circle, right? So you go back to the beginning, and it seems like there's a status quo, but that status quo is completely different than what it was the first time around. And I think moving on here a little bit in chapter 17, you talk about your new definition of fitness or that status quo for yourself. And you mentioned that it's more than just physical fitness, right? It's the readiness of your heart, your mind, and your spirit. And you redefine your health as alignment, right? Of your body, your mind, and your purpose in sync. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that because I think that's something that so few people A, think about, and B, actually get to achieve to a place where they're at a new status quo and they feel like they've felt that kind of alignment in their life. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that experience of redefining your own personal health and finding alignment in your life.
Sure. So, in the midst of triathlon training, it's all encompassing. Training for an Ironman means lots of time out of the house. It means lots of time on the bike. It means, you go out for a 5 hour bike ride on a Saturday and then a 2 hour run. And so, and then you're shot, right? You're not able to do anything afterwards, and you're actually pretty, difficult to be around. And so it's all encompassing. And, that became a goal, and I did it. Now I'd say I look for balance. And so I exercise every day. I run pretty much every day. I compete in races, but there's a little bit more balance in the way I do it. I'm not willing to sacrifice my family relationships for it. I'm not willing to sacrifice my work. And I think optimizing your life really comes down to balance, right? Are you doing work or school activities that are meaningful and moving you forward? Do you have a series of meaningful relationships? Are you exercising and, taking care of yourself in a way that makes sense? And that generally includes physical exercise, but also could include things like, going to therapy or meditation or mindfulness exercises or yoga or whatever works for you to get that downtime and get that peace of mind. And so these days I try to think through and say, how balanced is my life? Am I emphasizing one thing over another? And that's not a day-to-day balance. It's something that you look at in total. There are days in my professional life that are 16-hour days. And, I don't get to exercise as much as I want to, or I don't get to spend as much time with my wife or my kids. And then there's times when on the weekend I make sure that I'm spending that quality time or that I'm getting that extra, mile or two in on a run. And so it's really just being attentive to how you're maintaining that balance moving forward. Most of the folks I know that train for triathlons do it in a pretty assertive kind of way, and it's to the detriment of other things. In fact, I wrote about it in the book that if you screened most of us for addiction and some of the criteria we use for addiction, are you giving up things you love in order to do triathlon? Yes. Do you sometimes minimize the amount of time and effort you're spending on triathlon? Yes. None of us readily admit what we pay for a new bike or for gear and that kind of thing. And so you lie about how much things cost, and that's all pretty, that's all behavior that kind of tells that we use to tell people that you're too involved in one thing to the detriment of others. And so I think that balance is really, really important. And those things aren't mutually exclusive. I mean, you want to be successful at school and at work. You want to have a happy and successful family life. You want to have the peace of mind, and you want to be relatively physically fit. I think it's possible to do all those things in 24 hours. People who say to me, I don't have time to work out, are the same people who spend an hour scrolling on their phones in the morning. Don't scroll on your phone. Do 20 jumping jacks and 10 sit-ups and 20 push-ups instead of scrolling on social media for
I love
20
it.
minutes.
No, that's awesome. I think that's so fantastic. It's funny because I'm pretty sure I was scrolling this morning after I woke up, but
Yeah.
I'm gonna keep that in mind for tomorrow. I think
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting to me because with your journey, right? I think there's two stages even with stagnation, and the first is obviously when you start. It's hard to start. I think that's for a lot of people that's a very difficult stage just to register for that first 5K or that first marathon or the first Ironman. But the other difficult part is when you get past all these things and when obviously your mind's or your body's not in the same place as it may have been before, the diagnosis and things like that. That's also a difficult stage and a place where a lot of people stagnate as well, right? But here almost it seems as though you're motivating yourself to keep going forward. And you quote, Robert Frost's poem, Miles to Go Before I Sleep. And I found this kind of funny because you've almost finished the race in your own way, right? You got past the diagnosis. You did the marathons. You went from someone who never ran really to competing in your 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons, marathons, and then essentially the hardest race you can compete in. But you still wrote, or referenced this poem here, and the poem, at least the final part here goes, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. And essentially, for those of you who haven't heard of this poem or know what it means, it basically means there's still many things to do. There's many responsibilities to fulfill, many duties to complete before you can really rest. And I thought this was kind of funny, but when you heard that line or when you first read that poem, what makes that come to mind at a place where so many people stagnate?
Yeah, it's almost like a rebirth, right? I feel like I've been given, a second or a third shot at doing all the things I wanted to do. And when you face your own mortality, you begin to think through and say, did I live my life the way I really wanted to? Are there things that are undone? How do I really want to spend my time? For me, this was a reminder that, okay, so there's an, we all have a finite amount of time on this earth, and I've now got more of it. And so what do I want to do with that more of it? And, I've never been one to waste a whole bunch of time, but for me, each moment became a little bit more precious when you get a second shot. It's like, all right, I'm going to be okay. I'm actually going to get through this. Now I can go do all the things I want to do with a new sense of purpose and discernment. So I could be intentional about how I spend my time. And once you face a diagnosis like this, you start cataloging all the things that you wish you had done. Well, now you could go do them, right? It would be a shame if you didn't. So, I think the hardest part is getting started. You mentioned taking up a new habit or that kind of thing. For me, every time I do it, the hardest thing is getting out the door, lacing up my sneakers and getting out the door. It's not the first mile. It's getting out the door. Once you're out the door, though, it feels great. And there's never been a workout that I've regretted. There's never a time where I've come back and said, boy, I regret doing that. Right? You always feel a lot better. And for me, tying the two things together, my ability to do that now feels a lot like a privilege. It's not the same as it was. Like I said, I had, blood tests recently, and my blood work isn't back to where it should be because of chemo and radiation. I mean, those are pretty powerful drugs that kill cancer and kill healthy cells as well. And so I'm not back to where I was, but I'm out there and I'm doing it, and that's worth its weight in gold. And I'm not coming in first in any races, but I'm also not coming in last. And I'm sure as hell beating the guy that's sitting on the couch doom scrolling or watching TV. And so, for me, it was really, I've got a lot to do. I've got a lot of things that are important to me. I've been given a second or third chance, and man, I better not waste it.
I think that's a perfect segue into this chapter 18, the final chapter here, where you talk about transformation, right? Not just recovery, but becoming someone completely new because of it all. You talk about mentoring, serving, showing up, and doing everything that you do in your daily life, but doing it with joy, right? And here you had a line that I want to ask you about. You said, I want to swim, bike, and run through life doing three sports for 1,000 reasons. What does that line mean to you now that you've gone through it all?
Yeah, look, I triathlon served me really well in terms of getting me through this emotionally, physically, and otherwise. Um, and now I get back to doing that, and I get back to doing that with a different lease on life. It's a new lease in a lot of ways. I've always had that purpose, um, but this is all the more driven. And as I think about kind of my athletic life and the rest of my life, look, writing the book means that lots and lots of folks came out of the woods and write to me. They send me emails, they call me. And, they're looking for help. There are folks who are newly diagnosed. I recently did a speech in front of a labor union, and they were all labor union delegates. And as I was speaking and sharing a little bit about my journey, I could notice there was a woman who was crying in the audience, and then she left, and then she came back. And I felt terrible because I didn't really do any trigger warnings before I put the story out there. And the speech was all about taking care of your health and then sharing my own experience about how taking care of my health gave me some fortitude and strength in dealing with the race I never signed up for. And as I left, I stopped her and I said, are you okay? And she said, let's go outside. And we went outside, and she had lost her husband to colorectal cancer just 6 months beforehand. And I said, geez, I'm sorry. I probably should have put some warnings out there. And she said, no, 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 no. This is exactly where I needed to be today. And it's those little moments now in sharing the story that are just so laden with meaning. I will always remember that interaction now, right?
Yeah.
And so, we wouldn't have connected if it weren't for the fact that I wound up, being sent down this road, but also that I was willing to share it openly and honestly. I mean, look, for a guy, I got the two most embarrassing cancers that you could get, right? And so, so it takes a little bit to talk about it. But I also hope in talking about it that, people who might shy away from being screened will finally get screened. People who have questions about cancer will feel comfortable asking me, if not somebody else. That, people who have struggled or are struggling, it gives us the opportunity to connect in a way that, we couldn't connect with before. And so I didn't ask to join this club. Nobody has to join this club. But now that we're in it, there are some really, really wonderful connections that come out of it. And so
Yeah.
when I take kind of that mission driven stuff and some of the connections I wouldn't have had, and, match it up with the boost in my friendships, the boost in my purpose, the boost in my intentions, it really, again, I think I said to you, anyone who tells you cancer is a gift is lying. It's no gift whatsoever, but there are beautiful things that can come out of it. And so, I was never a guy that would get, the term Sunday scaries drives me crazy. And my folks who say, oh, it's Sunday, I got to go to work tomorrow. Have always told them, then you're in the wrong job.
Mm.
Like, you spend a lot of your time at work. And if you dread going to that place and doing the things you do, you should find another job immediately, even if it means you're going to make less money, because we spend most of our time doing this. But for me, that imperative has become much more important. Those connections with other people have become that much more important. And, look, I hate cancer as much as the next guy, and I feel like the best way to fight it is by creating connections with the people who are battling it. And, nobody fights alone.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. And, to wrap up here, I have one last question. It's kind of a loaded one, so take as long as
Yeah.
you need to either think about it or to answer it. I think in this final chapter, in these final words here, you write, and you've spoken about this as well, that surviving twice, right, gave you a brand new head start, right? And here for this kind of final question, I want to put away everything that maybe you associate with yourself, or all the titles, or whether that's your PhD, or you're a runner or a cancer survivor, all these things, right? Putting them away for a second. After going through all of this, right? After surviving, after having a brand new head start, and kind of being able to see life. I mean, you said it yourself, right? A new lease on life. Um, in what ways have you decided to live your life differently or more intentionally? Not just from a running standpoint or from a physical standpoint, fitness, but from a family standpoint, a social standpoint. I know we mentioned a little bit about social, emotional, a spiritual standpoint, even your professional life. I mean, you mentioned that if you're not doing something every Monday, every weekday that you enjoy or that you get joy out of, you're in the wrong profession, right? And in that way, what have you learned through this entire journey, not just of the cancer, of the surviving, of the running, but in this journey of life, right? For someone as such as myself who's just beginning to get into that, um, that made you live your life more intentionally or differently.
If I had to boil it down to one word, it would be authenticity. Because once you face this, the other stuff seems really, really, really small. Um, and you come to understand, similar to the story I told you about the woman in the audience as I was giving the speech. you never know what other people are going through, and people are going through some pretty significant stuff. I've always kind of prided myself in kind of being who I am and take it or leave it. But we all play roles in life, right? Whether I'm playing the role of the PhD or the CEO or the author, we all play these roles in life. But at the end of it, we're all really vulnerable and fallible human beings, just doing the best we can, sitting on a rock, hurtling through space at a million miles per hour, right? And so, for me, I don't want to say I care less about what people think, because I care when people are struggling, but I'm more authentic now than ever before. Little things, they stay little things, because, there's so many big things, and your life can change in a moment's notice. I described to you in our first conversation about how I got my first diagnosis via a text message. Nobody, it's somewhat trite, to say life can change at a moment's notice, but let me tell you, it can. One phone call, one text message, one move, and your life can, at 1 o'clock, it looks one way, at 1:03, it can look very, very differently. And that means you live life in a very, very different way. Yeah, it feels more vulnerable, but quite frankly, we are all vulnerable to any number of things. And I've become, I think, more authentic in the way I live my life. I say what I need to say and then let the chips fall where they may. But I also understand that we're all fallible and really doing the best we can. And so, I like to think that I came out of cancer emotionally better than I started. Physically, it always takes a toll, right? Every disease leaves you in a little bit worse shape, but you rally back and you battle back over time. But my friendships and relationships are stronger than they've ever been before. Emotionally, I feel stronger than I've ever been before. And there's something that's actually pretty liberating and freeing about contemplating your entire existence, coming out on top and saying, I'm just going to go do a whole bunch of great things.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's incredible. And with that, we'll close out part three of Every Mile Matters. This was an incredible series of episodes. I enjoyed it a lot, and possibly the most personal and vulnerable series of recordings we've ever done. This section three, this part three, closes this book out not just with this sense of triumph, but almost with tenderness of humility and reflection. And I think through today's episode, we learned a lot, right? We learned that endurance doesn't end at the finish line, it evolves into empathy. That survival isn't just the story's end, it's your new beginning. And we learned that true health isn't just the absence of pain, it's the presence of your purpose. So, Dr. Reynolds, thank you so, so much for joining us today and in the past recordings. This was an incredible time. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Yes, I loved our conversation. Your insights were very, very helpful, and you asked all the right questions,
Thank you so
to kind of
much.
bring both us and your audience along in the journey. So I enjoyed the journey very much. It sounds like you did too. I hope your audience loves it as well. If folks are interested in picking up the book, it's at all the major booksellers, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can look me up online. I've got a pretty decent social media following. It's somewhat odd for a 59-year-old guy to have a TikTok account, but I do. As well as Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, all the places that you would find somebody like me, and sometimes people not like me.
I love it. Yeah, please check it out. Highly, highly recommend. And, obviously, to our listeners out there, we pray that no one ever has to go through anything like this. But regardless of what you're going through or what challenges you face in your own life, whatever race you're running, right? Remember that every mile matters. And remember to keep on learning, keep on changing, and keep on growing. We'll see you next time.